Reality is never random static, and your deeper mind is always catching the hidden signal. Stay until the end to discover how your mind decodes hidden patterns of reality.
You think of a name you haven't spoken in 11 years. Your phone rings. It's them. Something tightens behind your ribs. Not fear, recognition. Statisticians have a word for this. They call it coincidence. They'll tell you the brain is built to hunt for patterns, sharpened by millions of years of survival, and that if you live long enough and cross paths with enough people, weird overlaps are bound to happen. Simple math. They're not wrong. They're just not finished. Because between the explanation and the experience, there's a gap the numbers don't fill. You didn't guess the phone would ring. You felt it coming, a half second of certainty that arrived from nowhere and vanished before you could question it. Most people shrug it off before they finish the thought and file it away without a second look. But it doesn't stop at phone calls. You dream about a car crash, vivid and specific, and wake up uneasy for reasons you can't name. And 2 days later, someone you know is in an accident on that same stretch of road. You pick up a random book at a stranger's house, flip to a random page, and land on the one paragraph that answers the exact problem you've been stuck on for months. A song you haven't heard in a decade comes on the radio the moment you're thinking about the one thing it's about, word for word. Ask a room full of people if something like this has happened to them and watch how many hands go up. Quietly, almost embarrassed, like admitting to something they were told not to believe in. One man refused to file it away. He was one of the most disciplined minds in the history of psychology, trained in the coldest empirical traditions of European medicine, with every professional incentive in the world to dismiss what he was seeing in his own consulting room. Session after session, patient after patient. He didn't dismiss it. He spent 3 decades building a theory around it instead. A theory that put his reputation on the line, alienated colleagues who thought he'd gone soft and mystical, and quietly reshaped how an entire century thought about the boundary between mind and world. His name was Carl Gustav Jung. He wasn't a mystic. He was a Swiss psychiatrist who trained under some of the strictest empiricists of his era, a man who spent his early career diagnosing schizophrenia with clinical precision before he ever let himself take coincidence seriously. That detail matters because it's the reason his colleagues couldn't simply wave him off as a crank. Cranks don't build careers on rigor first and mysticism second. Jung did the opposite of what you'd expect from someone chasing a strange idea. He made you earn the strangeness by sitting through decades of hard evidence first. It cost him. Colleagues who had once respected his clinical work started keeping their distance the moment he began publishing on this material, and some never came back around. He knew exactly what it would look like from the outside, a respected psychiatrist trading his credibility for something that sounded, on paper, like superstition. He published anyway, decades of it, case notes stacked on case notes, because the alternative was pretending he hadn't seen what he'd seen. And the gap he found waiting behind ordinary coincidence didn't just complicate the statistics. It suggested the statistics were answering the wrong question entirely. There's a name for what happened to you the last time this occurred, the last time you knew something a half second before you should have. You're not going to like how well it fits. Stay with this one, because by the end, you won't be able to look at your next coincidence the same way again. Here's the standard explanation of coincidence, the one you were handed without ever asking for it. 2 things happen close together in time. Your mind, desperate for order, links them. Nothing actually connects the dream of your friend to the phone call that follows it. No hidden force, no chain running underneath. Just a brain doing what brains do, manufacturing meaning out of static. Jung agreed with half of that. He agreed the 2 events share no cause and effect. One doesn't create the other. There's no thread running from the dream to the phone call. Where he broke from the room was the second half. He refused to accept that the meaning itself was manufactured. He proposed something stranger, that certain coincidences carry meaning that isn't invented by the person noticing it, but discovered by them, a meaning that was already there, waiting before the mind caught up to it. He gave it a name, synchronicity, not a magic word, a clinical term, defined with the same rigor he applied to every diagnosis he ever made. Two or more events unconnected by cause, lining up because they mean something. Not because one triggered the other, but because both were expressions of the same underlying pattern, surfacing in two places at once. Picture two actors delivering the same line on two different stages at the exact same second. No script passed between them, no signal, no cue whispered from the wings, and yet the same words land in the same instant. That's the shape of the problem Jung was staring at for 30 years. He also drew a line most people who quote him today conveniently skip. A meaningless coincidence is just two unrelated events brushing past each other on their way to nowhere. A true synchronicity carries what he called felt significance, a weight you recognize instantly without needing anyone to tell you it matters. You don't talk yourself into a synchronicity being important. You just know. The recognition arrives before the reasoning does, and that's the detail that made Jung suspicious the standard explanation was incomplete. Manufactured meaning usually needs a story built around it before it feels real. This kind doesn't. It hits first. The story, if it comes at all, comes after. He located the phenomenon in a specific territory, not fully inside the mind, not fully outside it either. A borderland, the seam where the private world of thought meets the public world of matter and event. Most of the time, that seam stays sealed. Psychology handles one side of it. Physics handles the other. They rarely speak because under ordinary circumstances, they don't need to. Synchronicity, in Jung's framework, is what happens when the seam opens. He wasn't working this out alone, and that detail matters more than most people realize. For years, Jung corresponded with Wolfgang Pauli, one of the founding physicists of quantum mechanics, a man with a Nobel Prize and zero patience for sloppy thinking. Pauli was watching his own field discover something unsettling at the subatomic level. Particles that seemed connected with no signal passing between them at all, correlated across space with nothing to explain the link. If matter itself could behave that way at its smallest scale, Jung asked a dangerous question. What if the human psyche, made of the same universe, was capable of the same kind of a causal connection, only expressed through meaning instead of physics? Pauli didn't hand Jung a finished theory. He gave him something more valuable: permission to keep asking the question in a field where careers were built on rigor rather than intuition. The two men spent years exchanging letters, arguing, checking each other's excesses, each one refusing to let the other get lazy with the idea. Pauli had his own reasons to take the unconscious seriously. He'd gone through a period of personal crisis severe enough to send him into analysis, and the dreams he brought into that process were strange enough, structured enough, that even a physicist trained to distrust anything unmeasurable started to wonder if his own mind was running on rules nobody had written down yet. It's easy to dismiss a psychiatrist for suggesting the universe runs on more than cause and effect. It's much harder to dismiss him when a Nobel laureate in physics is nodding along, unsettled by what his own equations kept implying. Cause and effect was never the only kind of order available to reality. It was just the order that happened to be easiest to measure. His patient was a woman locked inside her own intellect, highly educated, fiercely rational, and every session she arrived armed with a new argument, a new logical structure built to keep her feelings at a safe, analyzable distance. Jung would later say her defenses were almost mechanical in their precision, a mind so committed to reason it had sealed off every door reason couldn't open. Progress had stalled completely, and it had stalled for a long time. Then in one session, she began describing a dream from the night before. In it, someone had given her a piece of jewelry, a golden scarab beetle. As she spoke the words, Jung heard a soft, persistent tapping at the window behind him. He turned. Outside, knocking against the glass as if trying to get in, was a rose chafer, the closest living relative to a scarab found anywhere in that part of the world, its shell catching the light in the same gold-green sheen as jewelry. Jung opened the window, caught the beetle mid-flight, and set it in her open hand. "Here," he said, "is your scarab." Something in her broke open that day, not her mind, the wall she had built around it. The moment was too precise, too exactly timed to file away as noise. A symbol from the deepest layer of her unconscious had appeared, uninvited in physical form, at the exact second she was describing it out loud. Her rationalism, the armor she had worn into every prior session, didn't stand a chance against something that exact. Treatment moved forward from that day in a way it never had before, and it kept moving. Jung didn't claim the beetle caused her breakthrough through some supernatural mechanism reaching down from above. He claimed the coincidence was a message her psyche could finally hear, because for once the outside world had spoken her own interior language, at her own moment of need, in a shape she couldn't argue her way around. He would go on to write about the case for years afterward, returning to it in lectures and letters, because it gave him the one thing a purely theoretical argument never could: a witness. Not just his own account of what he'd felt, but a second person in the room who had watched the same beetle land on the same glass at the same impossible second. This wasn't the first time something like it had shaken him. Years earlier, during a tense evening with Sigmund Freud, at a point when the friendship between the two men was already falling apart under the weight of their disagreements, Jung felt a strange heat rise through his chest and told Freud that in a moment they would hear a loud crack from the bookcase behind them. Seconds later it happened, a sharp bang loud enough to startle them both, coming from exactly where Jung had pointed. Freud called it nonsense. Jung, certain the moment meant something, told him it would happen again, and it did. A second crack from the same bookcase, right on cue. Freud never accepted the incident as anything but coincidence. Jung never stopped treating it as the first hard evidence that something in his own psyche could reach outside the walls of his skull and touch the physical room around him. You have almost certainly lived a smaller version of this and never given it a name. You think of a song, obscure, half-forgotten, and it plays on the radio within the hour. Or maybe it's smaller and stranger than that. You lose someone, and in the days after, a bird behaves oddly near your window, lands somewhere birds don't normally land, stays longer than instinct should allow, and some part of you, older than logic, decides to read it as a visit. None of this proves anything under a microscope. That was never Jung's argument. His argument was narrower and far harder to shake off. The emotional charge you feel in that instant isn't decoration. It's data, your own psyche flagging an event as significant, using a channel that arrives before logic even has a chance to catch up to it. The question worth sitting with isn't whether these moments are statistically rare. It's why, out of every possible coincidence available to you, your mind keeps flagging the ones that land at the exact hinge point of your life. Most people picture the mind as sealed inside the skull. Private property, no trespassing. Whatever happens in your head stays in your head, cut off from the physical world by the simple fact of being made of thought instead of matter. Jung didn't buy that boundary, not entirely, and not after everything he'd sat through in his own practice. Beneath the personal layer of the unconscious, the one built from your own memories and your own private history, Jung proposed a deeper layer, not built from your life at all. A layer shared across the species, populated by patterns so old and so consistent, they show up in myths and rituals from cultures that never once made contact with each other. He called these patterns archetypes. He called the shared layer they live in the collective unconscious. Here's the unsettling part. If that deeper layer is shared rather than personal, it might not follow the same rules of time and space that govern your body. Your body is stuck in this room, this hour, this one point on the calendar. The deeper psyche in Jung's model isn't obligated to be quite so local. It touches something older, something that doesn't experience past, present, and future as three separate sealed rooms. The scarab didn't tap on just any window. It tapped on the window of a mind that was finally ready to open it. And that's worth sitting with before we go further, because the timing was never random. It arrived exactly when she was ready to hear it. Not a week earlier, not a week later. That precision is the whole argument in miniature. Every archetype living in that deeper layer, the wise stranger who shows up at the exact moment guidance is needed, the warning sign nobody can quite explain, the messenger animal that crosses your path at the worst or best possible moment, shows up across cultures with no possible contact between them, because these figures were never learned the way a language is learned. They were built into the species, the same way an instinct is built in, passed down through structure rather than memory. A layer that old isn't obligated to respect the same walls your personal, individual mind respects. It doesn't experience your death as unthinkable because it has already watched 1,000 generations die. It doesn't experience the future as sealed shut because it was never fully confined to your particular slice of time to begin with. You can see the fingerprints of this layer without ever reading a page of Jung. Cultures separated by oceans and centuries independently produce the same handful of figures. The trickster who upends the old order, the wise elder who appears right when a younger person is lost, the flood that wipes the world clean and starts it over. No trade route explains that overlap. No shared ancestor sat all of them down and taught them the same story. Jung's explanation was that these patterns weren't transmitted at all. They were already there, underneath culture. The way the capacity for language is already there before a single word gets taught. This is the part where the theory stops being a curiosity about beetles and starts being a claim about the structure of your own mind. A claim that the walls you assume are there might be thinner in places than you've ever had reason to test. Jung noticed something consistent across his case files, something that took years of notes to see clearly. These meaningful coincidences didn't scatter randomly across a person's life. They clustered, and they clustered hard, around moments of crisis, transformation, grief, falling in love, facing death, or standing at the edge of a decision that would permanently redirect a life. In calm, uneventful stretches, the phenomenon goes quiet. At the threshold moments, the ones that actually matter, it gets loud. Jung had already spent decades studying how the unconscious pushes back against the conscious mind. Dreams in his model weren't random discharge, some kind of neural exhaust. They were correction, a system pushing against whatever one-sided position the waking self had taken, fixing something the person couldn't fix on their own. He came to see synchronicity as the same corrective mechanism, only now operating in the world instead of in sleep. When you get too rigid, too locked into a single interpretation of your own life, like the woman with the scarab, the psyche doesn't just send a dream to correct you. On occasion, it reaches further. The correction shows up outside your skull entirely, tapping on the actual glass of an actual window, close enough to touch. That pattern led Jung to a working theory that still unsettles people who take it seriously. Synchronicity functions as an alarm system wired into the deeper structure of the mind that activates precisely when the unconscious has something urgent to deliver to the conscious self. Not random static, a signal, timed to arrive exactly when you're finally in a position to hear it and not a moment before. He tied this directly to what he called individuation, The long, often uncomfortable work of becoming a fully integrated person instead of a scattered one. At the exact moments a person is being pushed to grow, to confront something they've been avoiding for years, to step into a version of themselves they haven't earned yet, the coincidences intensify. They don't arrive on quiet Tuesdays for no reason. They arrive at the door you've been refusing to open. Jung saw this pattern repeat often enough across his patients that he stopped treating it as anecdotal. The engineer who kept dreaming of drowning right before he finally left the career his father had chosen for him. The widow who kept finding the same coin always heads up in the weeks she was deciding whether to sell the house. None of these people went looking for a sign. The sign found them right at the fork in the road, and not 1 week earlier when it would have meant nothing. There's an old alchemical term Jung borrowed for the deeper reality underneath all of this. The unus mundus, one world, not two separate substances, mind and matter, awkwardly bumping into each other. One thing, wearing two faces. We only experience them as separate because our senses were never built to catch the seam between them. If he's right, synchronicity isn't the universe breaking its own rules to send you a sign. It's the rare moment you happen to be standing close enough to the seam to notice it was never fully closed in the first place. Here's what changes once you actually understand this theory instead of just hearing about it. You stop being able to file coincidence away as noise. The next time a name surfaces in your mind seconds before it appears on your screen, you won't shrug. You'll notice the timing. You'll notice what you were feeling in the exact moment it happened. Because according to Jung, that feeling is the real message. And the coincidence is only the envelope it arrived in. Start paying attention to when these moments strike you. Not randomly scattered across your calendar, but clustered around your own thresholds. The week before a decision you'd been avoiding for months, the week surrounding a loss, the days right before you finally change course on something you'd sworn to yourself you'd never change. That clustering is the evidence. Not proof in a courtroom sense. Jung never claimed that much, but a pattern too consistent to keep calling chance once you know to look for it. Most coincidences really are static, and Jung never asked you to believe otherwise. He never asked you to treat every strange overlap as a message from the deep. He asked something narrower and far harder to shake off once you've heard it. That a small number of them are messages, and that dismissing all of them equally, out of fear of looking foolish at a dinner table, might mean deleting the one signal that actually mattered. Somewhere in your own history there is already a scarab beetle. A coincidence so exact, so precisely timed to what you were feeling in that instant, that some part of you has never fully explained it away, no matter how many times you've tried. You've probably told the story once or twice, watched people nod politely, and moved on. Most people never go back to that story and ask the harder questions sitting underneath it. Maybe it wasn't a beetle. Maybe it was a phone call that came at the 1 second you needed it to. A stranger's sentence on a train that answered a question you told no one you were asking. A name that surfaced in your mind and then, hours later, in your inbox. You filed it under strange and moved on, the same way everyone does because the alternative was sitting with something you couldn't fully explain. So ask it now. What if that moment wasn't your mind inventing meaning out of nothing, but your mind finally catching a signal that had been trying to reach you the entire time, waiting for the one instant you were finally still enough to notice it? And if that's true, if the deepest layer of your own psyche really is capable of reaching across the boundary of ordinary time to flag the moments that matter most, then one question is left standing, and it isn't going anywhere. What happens to the people who keep receiving that signal and keep choosing not to listen?
Coincidences are never accidents. They are messages from the deepest layers of your psyche. Never ignore the signal. Subscribe, like, and comment your own impossible coincidence story.